Welcome to Network Africa. Coming up on the program, we have the latest from Cairo following the murder of about 19 policemen at the Sinai Peninsula. Then, no progress so far. The United Nations Security Council is deeply disturbed that things in Burundi are worsening by the minute. And later, despite the warnings from the European Union asking migrants to desist from heading to Europe, the number of refugees double.
I want to go to my family in Sweden, my family there. We try, inshallah we will go.
We're glad to have you join us on the Monday of this Holy Week, the week before Easter. This is Network Africa with me, Cynthia Are. Just before we check in to see what's happening in Cairo following the murder of 19 policemen in the Sinai Peninsula, here's a summary of the top 3 stories which made headlines this weekend, including the incident in Egypt, which I just mentioned.
In Congo, voters went to the polls on Sunday under a government-imposed communications blackout as longtime leader Denis Sassou Nguesso sought to extend his rule over the Central African oil producer. Sassou Nguesso is heavily favored to win the polls. He faces 8 opponents, including retired General Jean-Marie Mokoko, who is seen as the strongest challenger. Having ruled from 1979 to 1992, when he lost an election, Sassou Nguesso regained power in 1997 after a brief civil war, and then went on to win disputed elections in 2002 and 2009. Then in Kenya, a military spokesman, David Obonyo, says 21 Al-Shabaab militants were killed by the army in a town in southern Somalia after 2 of its own soldiers were killed in an ambush by the insurgents. Following the incident, 19 AK-47 rifles, 3 rocket-propelled grenades and a pistol were recovered. Somalia's government is battling to rebuild the Horn of Africa nation after more than 2 decades of conflict. Al-Shabaab ruled large parts of Somalia until 2011, when it was driven out of Mogadishu by African Union and Somali troops. Finally, on Saturday, security and medical source says at least 13 Egyptian policemen were killed in the Sinai Peninsula when Islamist militants fired a mortar round at a security checkpoint in the city of Arish. Islamic State claimed responsibility on several websites for the attack, and Egyptian state media later confirmed it. Ambulances were subjected to heavy gunfire as they attempted to reach the wounded. Eyewitnesses reported hearing a massive explosion and said the city's entrances and exits had been closed off by security forces.
Well, joining us from Cairo to fill us in on the latest regarding the story which you just saw about the 19 policemen killed in the Sinai Peninsula is the Voice of America's Edward Iranian. Edward, thank you very much for your time.
Cynthia.
Now, what is the latest regarding this incident?
Well, the Egyptian military says that it's arrested a number of militants. I guess the figure they gave was 10 during clashes in Sheikh Zayed. That's not far from Arish, where this incident took place. They're also trying the diplomatic tact. Last week, they were talking to the Hamas group in Gaza. Many Egyptian military officials, if you talk to them in private, will tell you they think that Hamas is heavily involved in this, whatever you want to call it, this insurgency or whatever violence is taking place in the north of the Sinai. They've tried somewhat successfully to close a lot of the tunnels leading from Gaza. I think the violence has decreased somewhat, but every so often you have incidents like this which are strong enough to sort of get public attention focused on the problem again.
Well, Edward, about 2 weeks ago, we discussed what analysts were saying about President Sisi actually putting his contacts to use, especially the one with his counterpart, his Russian counterpart. What do you think it's time for him to actually make use of this contact with what we're seeing in the escalation of attacks now?
Well, I think he's making use of whatever contacts he has. He was in Saudi Arabia about a week ago attending Saudi military maneuvers, sitting next to King Salman. King Salman is one of Egypt's major allies. The Gulf Cooperation Council is pretty heavily invested in supporting Egypt. President Putin has also been an ally. Of course, there was a bit of friction over the airplane crash in the Sinai at the end of October. There is an Egyptian military delegation which is in Moscow right at the moment. So obviously they are trying to, the Egyptian military is trying to use those contacts.
Now, what is the sense you get with when you're interacting with Egyptians, especially with what's going on regarding security? Are they still confident in President Al-Sisi's government?
That's a very interesting question. I think it has multiple tangents. First of all, if you read what's on Twitter, which is very interesting, you get the sense that a lot of it is wishful thinking on the part of people in foreign capitals who'd like to see President Sisi toppled, whereas on the ground here, it's a lot more muddled. I think basically you've got the people who support Sisi very strongly who still do, those who don't support him, the Muslim Brotherhood and their allies who still don't, and the people in the middle. Let's just, since we can't really take an accurate poll, let's just say that's 30% who strongly support, 30% who strongly oppose, and the other 40% in the middle. The people in the middle, I'd say, were sort of pro-Sisi at the outset, very, carried over by the emotion of the moment. And I'd say now they are probably more preoccupied with the economic situation, which isn't all the government's doing, because you've got a lot of outside forces which are sort of hampering the economy, without going into detail. But yeah, I'd say his gloss of popularity has probably come down a notch or two, but I don't think he's extremely unpopular either.
Well, we'll definitely be reaching out to you later, Edward, to probably talk about the economic situation which you just mentioned. But thank you very much for joining us on Network Africa.
My pleasure, Cynthia.
Now, just when it appeared as though Burundi was taking a step forward, the United Nations Security Council is concerned that the East African country is actually taking 2 steps back. While addressing a Security Council meeting on Burundi, the top UN human rights official explained that he was concerned by the lack of progress and gross human rights violations. Burundi was thrown into crisis in April of last year when President Nkurunziza decided to run for a controversial 3rd term, which he won in July of 2015.
Continued human rights violations and impunity for perpetrators mean that many of Burundi's people live in terror. The country remains on the brink of a sudden escalation of violence to even more massive proportions.
I expressed my profound worry that the potential spiraling of violence risks relapse into civil war. I urge the government to take measures to address the continued violence and impunity that fuels it.
UN Secretary General Mr. Ban Ki-moon still to come on Network Africa, despite the warnings from the European Union asking migrants to desist from heading to Europe. The number of refugees doubled. Details in just a moment.